Hello, it's Susan Crutchfield with the Noonan Carnegie Library, and I'm here with another Throwback Thursday for you. Today we're going to be talking about the Carnegie Library, the early years, so join us as we learn some history. The Carnegie Library opened in June of 1904 with a reception that was described in the Coweta County Chronicles as one of the great events of Noonan's history. The influence of the library on the culture of the community, which was a paper written by the late Charles L. Thompson, was read aloud during this reception. There was also an opening prayer, singing, and an orchestra who played selections of music. Charles L. Thompson's father gave a short history of the Carnegie up to that point, and T.E. Atkinson, who was the president of the Board of Education, spoke on the relations of the library to the public schools. The first librarian of the Carnegie was Mrs. D.B. Woodruff. The initial hours of the Carnegie were 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. They began with 17 magazines available in the reading room that included North American Review, Bookman, Scribner's Youth Companion, and Literary Digest. Noonan's first ever Chautauqua began in the Carnegie Auditorium in 1904. On July 23, 1904, the Chautauqua season closed out with former Tennessee Governor Bob Taylor as the speaker at the Carnegie. According to the Macon Telegraph, many visitors from the surrounding country attended the Chautauquas in Noonan. Other speakers that season included Dr. Frank Dixon and the Honorable John Temple Graves. The venture was deemed a financial success, and the Chautauquas were predicted to be held for many years in Noonan. In 1905, there were 1,824 volumes in the Carnegie Library, as well as 3,000 daily Congress records. This was the way that people could keep up with what was going on in Congress, and the records came from the Superintendent of Libraries in Washington, D.C. Carnegie librarian Mrs. D.B. Woodruff gave the Noonan Weekly readers a Happy New Year message in the January 5, 1906 edition of the Noonan Weekly News. She said, "The Noonan Carnegie Library, though but a youngster of 18 short months, presents most cordial New Year good wishes to the progressive citizens of Noonan, and thanks the wise efforts that enabled it, as a latter-day Minerva, to spring full-armed from the brain of Jove. A goddess of wisdom indeed should every well-directed library be. Yea, more, for all may reap the benefits accruing from this Minerva of Christendom. Not only a few noble, wealthy favorites of fortune as of old. It sprang from the altruist's brain of a grander character than the mighty Jove of old, Andrew Carnegie, whose footsteps blossom with the immortelles of 1,150 libraries." Mrs. Woodruff also reminds readers of the efforts of the late Charles L. Thompson to procure the funds for the library. She also asked for suggestions for books that patrons would like the library to purchase. She also thanked Robert Strickland for donating the Saturday Evening Post to the library, and she called the Carnegie Reading Room a quiet retreat, well-lighted and well-warmed. Now, doesn't that just sound like how it is today, except it's a little cold? In 1909, the library spent $1,022.05 on expenses. They seem to be operating on a razor-thin budget since they received their $1,000 stipend from the city of Noonan and brought in $40 in fines, so that didn't leave them much room for error. I really love how the librarian's reports are written so beautifully. Here's a selection from the librarian's report for February 18, 1910, from Mrs. Sue Wright, who was the current librarian at that time. "It is a common saying that we live in an age of progress, but it is a remark that may be made of any age. For unless the world does progress constantly, our condition would be pitiable. Some years undoubtedly show a more marked advance than others, and the result is pleasing, and so it is with our library the past year. Our aim should be to make this institution so necessary to the citizens of Noonan that its steadily growing power for good will be clearly shown in the statements of its work made year after year. I am sure that all the members of the board have that object in view, for since my 2 years' term as librarian, each one of you has signified your approval of any suggestion in the way of improvement. You have shown that you are of the opinion expressed by Henry Ward Beecher that we should live and labor in our time, that what came to us as seed may go to the next generation as blossom, and that what came to us as blossom may go to them as fruit, and this is what we mean by progress." The Carnegie had 2,526 books at the beginning of 1909. During that year, 375 volumes were purchased at a cost of $357.27. It's really interesting reading the list of volumes that was added, such as the Library of Literary Criticism, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, and certain delightful English towns. That sounds like a really fun book, and I wish I could read that. I sure wish we still had some of these books. I would love to take a look at them, being from the early 1900s. 13,137 books were lent out that year, and there was a special category of library card for students of telegraphy. There's a really interesting history of telegraphy in Noonan. College Temple offered a course for telegraphy beginning in 1876. College Temple was our local college, and it began as a women's college, but did eventually let men in as well. It was located by College Street on the west, Temple Avenue on the south, and Kellogg Street on the east. This is where the Children Connect Museum is today. College Temple was the first school for girls in the state to teach industrial arts such as typography and telegraphy. Sadly, the school did close in 1888, and the gorgeous building is no longer standing. The students of telegraphy mentioned in the 1909 annual Carnegie Library report are not College Temple students. They were probably students of the Southern Business College and School of Telegraphy, which was based on the second and third floors of the Reese Opera House. This was fairly close to the Carnegie, so I can imagine students studying in the quiet of the library when they weren't actually in their classes. In 1911, according to librarian Mrs. Sue Wright, the Carnegie increased their book circulation, reference numbers, and volumes purchased. Mrs. Wright said that the ladies' study circle has many questions. City school children come in with a lot of questions as well, so their reference numbers were really great that year. In 1911, there were 3,370 books in the collection at the library, and new volumes purchased that year included Mrs. Felton's Memoirs of Georgia Politics, Warner's Young Folks History, and Fundamentals in Education, Arts, and Civics. Mrs. Wright said that the advisory board is the one who helps her choose the volumes. The board in 1912 was Mrs. T.E. Atkinson, Mrs. R.H. Hardaway, Mrs. W.G. Arnold, Mrs. T.G. Jones, Mrs. B.T. Thompson, who was Charles L. Thompson's mother, Mrs. W.J. Bowers, Mrs. T.F. Rawls, Mrs. Annie F. Orr, Mrs. Dr. Turner, Mrs. H.A. Hall, Mrs. H.P. Woodruff, Mrs. Edwin Parks, Mrs. J.H. Sims, Mrs. W.M. Askew, Mrs. B.B. Mabson, Mrs. O.W. Passavant, Miss Mary Goodrum, Miss Corrine Simrell, Miss Bessie Arnold, and Miss Edith Powell. The 1912 annual report of the Carnegie was published in the Herald and Advertiser on February 14, 1913. Mrs. Sue Wright's report stated that there were 3,500 volumes in the collection at the end of 1912. That did not include any of the government reports or published documents, which numbered in the thousands, according to her. They had 1,200 members of the library and circulated 13,357 volumes. This was a time when the librarians were elected by the board every year, so Mrs. Wright indicated in her report that she was pleased to be reelected by the Board of Trustees, and she praises her ability and painstaking work in the third person, which I found really amusing. She then states, "If there be grounds for criticism of any sort, it is because so trifling a sum is set apart for each year for the purchase of new books." I really enjoyed the fact that the only criticism she had of herself was really not a criticism at all, but a criticism of someone else. Mrs. Wright did note that many young boys were frequent visitors to the reading room to check out all of the magazines that they had available, and expenses for 1912 were $767.50. So it seems like their expenses have gone down a little bit when you compare them to prior years. They also had patrons who would bring in flowers on a regular basis to really brighten up the library. In April of 1912, the library opened on Friday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, and the Noonan Herald printed the following tribute to him. The headline reads, "Philanthropist's death deeply regretted here." Announcement of the death of Andrew Carnegie on Monday last at his summer home near Lenox, Massachusetts, caused deep regret in Noonan, as well as in hundreds of other towns in the United States that have been beneficiaries of his benevolence. During the lifetime of the late Charles L. Thompson, he entered into correspondence with Mr. Carnegie with the object of persuading the great philanthropist to make a donation for a public library in Noonan, And before the untimely death of that lovable young man, he had the satisfaction of realizing his cherished ambition for the town. Hence, the beautiful building which ornaments our public square stands as an appropriate memorial to our lamented young townsman, as well as to Mr. Carnegie. Tuesday, Mr. B.T. Thompson, chairman of the library board, sent the following message of condolence to Mrs. Carnegie. Mrs. Andrew Carnegie, Lenox, Massachusetts. You have our deep sympathy in your great sorrow and bereavement. Mr. Carnegie will live in the hearts of our people and in history as one of the world's greatest philanthropists. B.T. Thompson, Chairman, Trustees, Noonan Carnegie Library. As a mark of respect to Mr. Carnegie, the library was closed all day yesterday. I hope you enjoyed this discussion about the Carnegie, the early years, and join us again soon for another installment of Throwback Thursday.